James Wiseman is a controversial player for the Detroit Pistons. Some people love him. Some people are already out on him. Will they force the too big lamp to include James Wiseman? We have Jackson Lloyd, who is on the higher end on James Wiseman, to tell us why should you buy into James Wiseman long term, and will he help the Pistons immediately this upcoming season? We'll talk about all of that, everything to do with James Wiseman in today's episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast.
You are Locked On Pistons, your daily Detroit Pistons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's the deal? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast. Per usual, I'm your host, Kuka Hill. You can find me over on Twitter at Kuka Hill. I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We are free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button. We are on our way to 10,000 subscribers. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, or you can leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. I think today's episode is going to be a really fun episode because James Wiseman is a player that I think is pretty controversial in the Pistons community right now. And I honestly, outside the Pistons community, he probably is pretty controversial just among the NBA community at this point. Top draft pick, hasn't worked out all the way at this point. And if you guys listen to the podcast, you guys know initially I was pretty high on the trade for James Wiseman, but then as he started to play more, I got lower and lower on him. I'm not too high on him right now, but I know the coverage on James Wiseman hasn't been too positive. So I decided to go out and find someone I followed on Twitter for quite a while who does a lot of NBA content, who covers the NBA, and is pretty, I would say, on the higher end of James Wiseman, to come on the podcast and tell us why you should be higher on James Wiseman. That's Jackson Lloyd. You can follow him on Twitter at Jackson Lloyd NBA. Jackson, first off, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, man. Really excited to be on the show. When you asked me to come on, I was like, this is perfect because it's not an everyday opportunity I can spiel about a player I'm high on. Anyways, yeah, just really excited.
Appreciate you coming on, man. Appreciate you coming getting time out to come on the podcast. But so like I said, we talked about this a little bit before we started recording, but the side of the screen, if you guys watch this on YouTube, says, what does Wiseman need to do? And I kind of want to change the topic a little bit. I kind of want to go in the direction of just before we get into what Wiseman's ceiling is, before we get into what his future in Detroit is, I just want to kind of say, so I'm not as high on James Wiseman. As I started watching more and more with the Pistons, I started to get lower on him. And his fit with the team is a little bit confusing for me right now. And I've came away, and now he's played very few games, a very small sample. But I'm a little bit lower on him becoming a big impactful player in the NBA. Can you tell my listeners and try to convince me, not just my listeners, but try to convince everyone or me and everyone listening, why should you be higher on James Wiseman? What is there about James Wiseman that you like, and why should people be higher on him and his future?
So first of all, I understand if people are skeptical of Wiseman or any player, but in my opinion, the Saddiq Bey, and I think it involved like 5 seconds trade with James Wiseman and all that. Given all that, it wasn't necessarily about James Wiseman. To me, it was about a player that, right or wrong, they didn't view Saddiq Bey as a fit going into an extension-eligible season, and they decided, let's pivot in another direction. And something I've noticed with Troy Weaver and previously like Dwayne Casey coach teams, he'll fixate on specific players that he may be high on. Like when he was in Toronto for his rookie season, he started Pascal Siakam, and a lot of people kind of looked at that and was like, what's going on? Toronto's supposed to be in a contending season. DeRozan and Lowry are playing at an all-NBA level. What's going on? With that, with the Troy, we even have options, examples like Bruce Brown playing a pretty fair amount even early on in his career when he was almost more of a guard. Now he's transitioned into like a small rolling big cutter extravaganza type player. So prefacing it with that, I think just from an asset standpoint, it was a interesting dart throw per se. But I'm high on Wiseman. I think that in Golden State, I underestimated how raw he was playing just 3 collegiate games. Obviously, top one of the top high school prospects. The COVID season was weird, obviously with the travel restrictions and whatnot, but even no summer league, just kind of a bang, bang, bang type schedule. Really weird season for the Warriors that year where they kind of had some transitional pieces with Wiggins being in his first full season with the team. Kelly Oubre, who also didn't exactly fit in. And then he gets hurt at the end of his rookie season and misses year 2. Last year for about the first 3 to 5 weeks, I want to say it was about 8 to 10 games. He was a rotation fixer with the Warriors, and he flashed, but he didn't impact the game. And I think ultimately Golden State decided we got to play our game. You know, we like the young guy, but we just got to go a different direction. Why I'm high on Wiseman is I think that he is obviously you can't teach 7'1", 240, 250, whatever he is. And a lot of people will push back on embracing an athletic player or a player that's physically dominant. But to me, that's something you can't teach. And if you're an athletic outlier or you're a really physically dominant player, you can be a little more mistake prone. You could be slightly out of position and still make up for it on raw talent. And with Wiseman, I just think that he has pretty solid touch. I don't really think he's a jump shooter now, but I think the touch will come into play on push shots and hook shots within that 8 to 12 foot range. And if the jumper comes, that's great. But to me, I think we'll see really improved touch around the rim. And I think that he has some untapped ball skills, not in the sense that he's going to be a Sabonis or Bam kind of DHO type. Duren, he's way better in dribble handoff game than James Wiseman, for example. But I think that Wiseman is a guy where if you throw him the ball, let's say pick and roll, they hedge it, you toss him a bounce pass, he's 14 feet from the rim, he can take a dribble or two and finish strong in time. Or if he catches in transition, he has to take a dribble, and then obviously I'm high on him, so I think that eventually he'll be able to take a strong dribble, Euro step, and finish through contact for an and one. So while I understand that Wiseman isn't an impactful player right now, I definitely think that getting a year and a half of team control and kind of seeing what happens with him is worth doing, especially because him and Bagley have a similar cap hit. I do kind of view those two as competing for playing time, but to me, it was just a trade that I don't really see the downside. Duren, his playing time dropped a little bit, returning from injury. I never viewed it as a Duren versus Wiseman thing. To me, when I saw that, I saw Detroit saying, we know what we have in Jalen Duren coming back from injury. Obviously, they had some shutdowns. I think Burks, Bogdanovich, and I'm forgetting someone offhand, but really retooled roster down the stretch of the season. Like Omaruri was a standout just for his energy and effort. Obviously not a great team. I just think it was a total evaluation period, and I didn't view that as some indictment against Duren or that the team was viewing Wiseman as a solution and pivoting off of Duren.
So I want to talk about Wiseman as what his ceiling is and what he is as a player right now that will possibly limit or extend his ceiling. But I guess to wrap up this segment, I want to ask you just real quickly and a quick answer. What do you believe James Wiseman, what does James Wiseman have to do for the Pistons this year to be a mainstay in the rotation, to beat Bagley? Because that does seem to be who he's going to be competing with for minutes. What do you think James Wiseman needs to do this upcoming season in the training camp, preseason, et cetera, to earn those minutes and become a mainstay in the Pistons rotation?
First and foremost, with this team moving forward for the next 5 years or whatever, 5+ years, he has to be able to play with Cade Cunningham. So first and foremost, Cunningham has to like playing with him. They have to establish some chemistry and shared experience on the court. But the big thing with Wiseman, I think his defensive positioning got a lot better. I think he ran into trouble where so many times on the defensive glass, he's not finding a body. And that might not sound like a big deal. You look at his rebounding numbers at an individual level, they're like outlier type stuff, like 8 boards in 24 minutes or whatever it was with the Pistons. But the issue is if you allow 1 or 2 guys to crash the glass against you a game, you might think, oh, that's not a big deal or whatever. But offensive rebounding, I'm sure you know, as a Pistons fan, you saw Andre Drummond kill teams on the offensive glass, and he was a guy who he would just attempt putback after putback. And, luckily now I think Duren will be passing more of those out, and it'll be an even better kind of production level. But for me, Wiseman has to improve on the defensive glass. That's the big thing to me.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said right there. I remember breaking down a video or a clip at the end of the season where James Wiseman, the Pistons have a great defensive rep. He actually has a good rep in drop coverage, and they force a contested long two, and they weren't able to secure the defensive stop because Wiseman kind of just turned around, looked up at the rim instead of finding a body and getting the rebound, and they ended up allowing a second chance point. So the whole defensive rep went for waste because they weren't able to close out the possession. That was something I've talked about on the podcast before with Wiseman as well, is that is an area he has to improve on. Securing the defensive stops is really pivotal for the Pistons and for James Wiseman if he's going to be their backup five out there. When we come back, I want to talk about where James Wiseman is at right now. What is his ceiling? How he can get there? We'll talk about all that when we can come back. But first, I've got to tell you guys about one of our sponsors, FanDuel Sportsbook. Get ready for the NFL season with incredible offers from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Plus, all customers who bet $5 will get $100 off NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. All my Lions fans out there, FanDuel has the Lions as slight favorites to make the playoffs and as slight favorites to win 10-plus games. I've never seen that before in my history of being a Lions fan. This seems like a fun year. If you want to spend a fun year watching the Detroit Lions, why not do it over at FanDuel? Now is the best time to join FanDuel. The app is easy to use, and you can be on everything from the spreads, the player props, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn and kick off the NFL season with an offer you don't want to miss. That's FanDuel, the official partner of the NFL. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. So Jackson, I want to take this segment and talk about where James Wiseman is right now as a player and what is his ceiling. Because I do agree with you with what you said in the first segment, that this was just a random dart throw, that James Wiseman is someone that Troy Weaver was high on pre-draft. He really liked him in that 2020 draft. And Saddiq Bey was someone they didn't view as a long-term piece for a lot of reasons that I've talked about before in the podcast. And I was definitely not big on Saddiq Bey either, so I was okay moving on from him because I also did not believe he was a good fit on the team and wasn't progressing in ways you'd like to see. So I was fine with them moving on with Saddiq Bey. And going after James Wiseman was basically just here's a guy that was drafted second. I was really high on pre-draft. I'm talking from Weaver's standpoint. Really high on him before the draft. If I can get him for someone that I don't really see as part of the future, I can bet on his ceiling. So what? It's going to be, it's a low risk, high reward kind of thing. So I do agree with that. I don't think it's really hurting the team, to be honest. And it was just a high reward, low risk kind of thing. My question here is, what is really the high reward? Because before the Pistons acquired James Wiseman, I agreed. From someone just outside point of view, I was like, this is a guy who drafted second. You go watch some of his highlights. It's like, dude, there's a guy 7'1" with that kind of wingspan should not be able to move like this. He has some plays where, like you said, he flashes just. He moves he just glides through the air sometimes. The way he moves is crazy. He is like a freakish athlete. So you're right that you can't teach that. And that kind of had me bought in from the get-go. Watching James Wiseman, one of the biggest reasons why I have become lower on the whole high reward thing is I think what if his biggest issue as of right now, and I'd like to get your thought. I usually ask my guests this kind of question when it comes to, do you believe that this is something that can be developed? And what I'm talking about is like your feel and understanding of the game. Do you believe that you can improve a feel of a player's feel throughout the career? I'm someone who believes that's one of the hardest things that you can develop throughout a career. I don't want to say either you have feel or you don't, but it kind of is. A lot of guys get drafted in, they have high feel, and that's why teams are really high on them. One of the things I see Wiseman really struggle with is that it just feels like he doesn't really, I don't want to say he doesn't know how to play basketball, but it really feels like sometimes watching him, he just doesn't know what to be doing or where to be at or what's coming next. And I feel like that's really what is the core of his struggles. And for me, it's just a player like that. It's hard for me to bet on. I don't like betting on players that exhibit low feel to me. So that's why I think Wiseman's ceiling is a little bit lower than people think. With that said, tell me why you think I'm wrong and why someone should bet on James Wiseman's ceiling.
So part of the reason, and to answer your initial question, I would agree that feel and kind of understanding of how to play or whatever is probably one of the most difficult things to develop, especially if you're not a player who's just going to be given a million on-ball reps to kind of learn through the bleeding, so to speak. But with Wiseman, a lot of the times when I watch him, I just think he's a guy that I don't think it's an effort thing, and I don't think a lot of the stuff is uncorrectable. To me, he looks like a player who is thinking while he's playing, and by that I mean he's not sure exactly where he needs to be every single time, and that causes him to be a beat late. And the Chicago game, I think it was in Detroit this season, down the stretch, was a really good example where the first 3 quarters he was kind of floating through the game, making absolutely no impact. Actually, I would say he was hindering the team. The big thing with Wiseman is to avoid those stretches. You're not going to always get 24 and 12. You're not always going to be the focal point of an offense, especially with Cade Cunningham, and Jaden Ivey is also a very talented ball handler, as well as their veteran guards too, for that matter. But it goes back to the rebounding point. You're not always going to be involved offensively, but you have to be able to make your presence felt. I think that when looking at Wiseman, players that he should look to mirror, not from a aspirational standpoint, but players that he can kind of mimic them just from a size and impact wise. Like, look at how Zubac plays with the Clippers, or Mitchell Robinson with the Knicks. And then Clint Capella, he gets off the ground a little bit quicker than Wiseman, but he's a guy, he runs rim to rim hard, and he's played on some teams with Houston and Atlanta. They have pretty ball dominant, dribble heavy guards, and he knows that if he just runs rim to rim, runs hard, pushes tempo, runs with his guards, that he's going to get rewarded. I think that with Wiseman, a big thing with him, and we've even seen this kind of come up with the Timberwolves, in my opinion. That's kind of my main team with Gobert and Cat, is that when guys expect the ball, sometimes they linger in a spot when they roll, or if they post up and seal, they expect the ball and they don't get it. They might sit there for another second or two, and you might get a 3-second call. But even beyond that, that can be detrimental to your team's offense because they need you to clear out, get to the dunker spot. And people are going to say Wiseman can't play 5 out or stretch the floor. I don't think that's a big deal, but you do kind of need to, once you dive to the rim, either set another screen or set a pin down screen weak side for your teammate, relocate to the dunker spot, get in position for once the ball's up on the rim to get the rebound. It's just things like that I do think will come with repetition. But to your point, I don't think he's ever going to be a grab and go player like a Draymond Green, where he just gets the ball, boom, in transition. If you have numbers, you're going to get a good look.
So I agree with everything you said. What would you say you believe? Because earlier in the segment, earlier in the podcast, you talked about how you're higher on his ceiling. What do you believe is his absolute best outcome? If everything were to break right for him, with him getting repetitions, with his rare athletic ability, his rare size, all that combination, and he does have raw skills. Like I know I come off sometimes as a Wiseman hater. Wiseman does have legit skills. There's times where we watched him grab a defensive rebound and go coast to coast and just finish with an 1 Euro step. We've seen it happen before. We've seen glimpses of him protecting the basket. We've seen glimpses of him, like you said in the first segment, his physical tools allow him to be maybe a touch late on a defensive rotation, or maybe a touch late recognizing something defensively, but his defensive or his physical attributes allow him to make the play anyways and deter around the rim. So he has some raw skills, and also he does have some ball skills as well, where he can get the ball at the high post, face up, and get all the way to the rim. Like, he does have that in him. He has a lot of raw talent. But what do you think is his absolute ceiling at this point? Do you think it still is? It's capable. It's still possible for him to reach the hype of the second overall pick one day. What do you think is the absolute best case scenario for James Wiseman at this point in his career?
Well, after the trade, I think it was Troy Weaver, he made the Bosch comparison. And I don't know if that was just a lefty thing, and they both like to face up a lot. Obviously, that's just pie in the sky, like 99th percentile outcome. My thing with Wiseman is I think he has an incredibly high ceiling, and I don't even necessarily think that he'll hit that ceiling. I just think he's so talented that if he hits his 40th percentile outcome, his 50th percentile outcome, that he'll just be a guy who's going to start 8 to 10 years in the league. He'll have some seasons where he'll get some kind of back-end all-star love. Think of a guy like how we've talked about Yusuf Nurkic, not comparing their play styles, or Clint Capella, kind of those guys, Jared Allen, those guys that are on any given season, they'll be the 5th to 15th best player in their position. The thing with Wiseman is people are always going to look at LaMelo and Halliburton going after him, and that does suck from the Warriors' perspective. But for me, and I do this with all the players that I evaluate, I try not to look at it through that lens, and especially from Detroit's perspective, just getting him for the seconds in a player that if they let Saddiq Bey get to an extension talks, I don't think they would have extended him. I think they would have told him to go get an offer sheet, and then I think they would have froze him kind of like the Hornets just did with PJ Washington. So I think that to me, it was about them getting a player that they had a year and a half to evaluate. I don't view it as it's a roster crunch, but I don't think it's that point in time or at the point where it's a huge issue that the Pistons can't navigate, because if you want to move on from Wiseman, I think you can just move on from him, because I guarantee if you wanted to trade him, there's another believer in the league for him. The big question to me, not to get ahead of myself, but with him being in a contract season, I don't think there's any chance that he gets extended, because I think that the Pistons would offer him something below the mid-level or right around there, just like a total upside swing deal if it came to that. I think that it'll be a situation where he's going to play out this season, and if it's just not working, I think that he's going to get traded, because his cap hold, I think, is around $20 million.
Yeah, his cap hold is pretty high.
So, yeah, like I said, I have high expectations for Wiseman from the standpoint that I think he'll be a starter, and that's kind of why I'm high on him, because I don't want to use this term because I think so much of the discourse around him is just pure negativity. Like I said before on Twitter, the players that I get the most messages about complaining when I post clips are Dylan Brooks and Wiseman. So I don't want to term it like this, but I honestly feel like he's the type of player who, even if he doesn't work out, he can still be a good NBA player in time. And I know that Warriors fans or Pistons fans watching the final stretch of last season will give the side eye to that, because it's not pretty. Like I'm not saying that it's been great, but I'm just saying, like, my optimistic view, I think that it's worth kind of combing into further.
So we're running a little bit long with this segment, but I wouldn't feel right if I didn't attack this point you brought up. So stick with me, everybody. But you brought up something earlier, and you said that you kind of made a comparison. We are going to dive even further into this, because this was what I wanted to talk about in the third segment. But would you agree, basically, I guess I'll tease it like this. Would you agree that Wiseman's best way to becoming a great player is to kind of, because this is what I believe. Now, you can disagree. I just want to know if you agree with me. Do you think he should be buying into being just a rim-running lob threat on offense?
I think that right now, in a new situation on the team he's on, that's how you're going to establish trust with your teammates. And I think that's how the Pistons want to play. To me, drafting Thompson, trading for Monty Morris to shore up the second unit. Obviously, Cade Cunningham is a great passer, and he'll hit ahead and outlet pass it to teammates too. Jaden Ivey is fast. Even the Joe Harris trade, I know that there's been some debate about whether he'll be in the rotation or not. Those are all players who can help you in transition. That's why I think it's a big point for James Wiseman. If you can stand out in that aspect of your game, you'll sleepwalk to 2 baskets a game doing that. And that might not sound like a lot, but if you're a player who, I assume if he wins the backup center job, he's going to play 20 minutes a game, you can leverage that to your advantage, where you don't have to pace yourself for 34 minutes. You can just floor it, just play. Like Kind of like when Clint Capella and Nene had the platoon split where they both played like 22, 24 minutes a game the first D'Antoni season. Wiseman can use that to his advantage, and he can just be a guard's best friend. And while he probably has greater goals than that in the league, that's just a great starting point because every team is looking for a center that obviously, guards screen action well and drop, rebounds well, etc. But if you can run the floor, get behind the defense and finish, you're going to find a spot in the rotation.
All right, we're going to dive further into that. I want to talk about James Wiseman's future in Detroit and what his future role is in Detroit and just overall in the NBA. This is something we're going to dive even further into. I can't wait for it. But you guys got to hear first from some of our lovely sponsors. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. So Jackson, this is where I really want. Maybe I should have started. I feel like it wouldn't make sense if I started the podcast with this, but then we'd kind of be like working backwards, like, oh, what's his future? And then talk about now. I feel like we probably should have started now and then worked our way to the future, but this is probably like my favorite part of the podcast. So one of my biggest complaints about Wiseman, and something you brought up earlier in the podcast, is that he struggled with when he would roll to the basket, he would roll into a post up or random on offensive possessions. He'd just go to the paint, post up, and sit there for like 2 seconds and really clog up the offense. I had Cade's brother, Cannon Cunningham, on the podcast I think last month or a month and a half ago. And one of the things he asked me, hey, do you like the double bigs? And I was like, no, not really. I really hate the double bigs. He said, I don't really like the bigs thing because you got a lot of bigs kind of sitting in the paint waiting for the ball instead of spacing the floor, rolling to the rim, and kind of spacing the floor out. And he kind of hinted at that he was talking about James Wiseman, but he didn't really say the name, obvious reasons. But like, I think everyone understood who he was talking about. That's one of the biggest complaints I feel like in the Pistons community from me and from people around the Pistons, that a lot of times he just wanted the ball a lot. He just wanted to post up and get the ball in the post and do his thing. Now, I don't think that's all on James Wiseman. I think that was a lot to do with the Pistons not knowing how to use them in that short amount of time. And I've been one of the people to say that I don't think Dwayne Casey is the most offensive creative coach of all time either. So I don't think it was all on Wiseman at all. But that kind of goes back to just overall my feel argument with him is that he kind of just wanders a little bit offensively and doesn't really know where to be, kind of like you said, relocate to the dunker spot, kind of space the floor out, whatever, that kind of thing. And to kind of buffer the point, his most used play type this past season for the Pistons was post-ups. Now, it's all small sample sizes, but he had 81 possessions in post-up. He was in the 15th percentile, was not very good at it at all. Where I'm going with this is I think James Wiseman's future in Detroit, if he wants to have a future in Detroit, and I think if he wants to have a successful long-term career in the NBA, which I agree, I think he has a chance to be a long-term player in the NBA. He could be a long-term starter in the NBA. I think there is a chance for that for him. But I do believe that future is him buying into, I'm going to use my physical attributes, my freakish athleticism. I'm going to set hard screens. I'm going to roll to the basket. I'm going to be a crazy lob threat. And I'm going to finish everything around the basket because he does have really good touch. And when he explodes to dunk the ball, or he gets the ball around the rim, he's trying to dunk on you. Like, it's going to happen. So I feel like if he were to just buy into that role and just really play hard defensively, run the floor like you're saying, and play within, and now obviously this requires the team to have some creativity, or not, maybe not even creativity offensively, but just have an idea of how to use them, which I don't think they really had the past season. To space the floor, have him be the one big on the floor, have him in a lot of screen and rolls where he's getting easy looks around the rim, finishing everything around the rim, and then getting better as a rebounder, like you said, and using his long wingspan, his athleticism, his 7'1" height to be a rim protector on defense. I think he could have a long career. Now that requires him to buy into that, and because it feels like that's not really probably where he wants to do. But I think that's his route to being an NBA player for a long time. With that said, do you agree that that's his future in Detroit? If not, what do you think his future is in Detroit? If he wants to be in Detroit long term, what they need to see from him to have a future here? And what's his overall future in the NBA? Do you think he should start in this area and eventually grow out somewhere and he can become something more? Or do you think his future in the NBA is just as that? What do you think overall about his future?
Well, with the Pistons specifically, and I was listening to some of your recent episodes to kind of get a feel for this myself, but they're going to start Stewart at the 4, right? He got the extension. He's got a pretty good shooting touch. So I think the double big thing, I think it's beyond Wiseman. I think Stewart's going to play the most at the 4. Among the kind of combo forward type size guys, would you say only Livers will get minutes at the 4 then too?
Yes.
Aside from Bagley and Wiseman?
Yes.
Okay.
Maybe a SAR and like some small ball lineups, but Livers.
Yeah. So that's what I was thinking too. But to that point, I think that initially they'll occasionally play Duren and Wiseman together. I don't think it's something that they're thinking like, oh, I can't wait till the 5-minute mark in the first quarter when we can deploy Wiseman and Duren. I think that they're going to play Wiseman. I assume that he's going to be the backup 5. Maybe Bagley beats him out. And then obviously none of this matters because that means he didn't play good enough to play. But I think that he's going to get on the floor most often, let's say 16 to 18 minutes a game as a backup 5, and 2 to 4 he might mix in depending on how they want to do the splits for the substitutions. But that's how he'll get on the floor. And while that doesn't scream future with the Detroit Pistons, with the restricted free agent especially, that's how he's going to showcase himself to not only the Pistons, but the entire league. And if he plays well, the Pistons are either going to get him on a decent market rate deal because he was a backup player, or he's going to get an offer sheet from a team and the Pistons won't match it. And either outcome, I think, is pretty good for Detroit from that standpoint, because either Wiseman plays well as a backup 5 and you retain him on a team-friendly deal, or he kind of just, fills in for the season and then you let him move on if you don't want to go down that route because you're pleased with Duren and Livers shows maybe he can be a 24 to 28 minute per game player and he can kind of fill in at the 4 spot. But yeah, I don't know. I think they like Isaiah Stewart. I think when he came into the league, a lot of people painted him as like a Reggie Evans energy type, but he's shown to be way more than that. Like, he's got all right touch. I don't think he's ever going to shoot 38% from 3 unless it was drastically low volume or just an outlier season, but he's got good feet. Like, if you ask him to switch or hedge, which I think teams will, if he's playing the 4, he will have to hedge screens a lot just because I feel a lot of teams prefer that on occasion, but I think he's a good player. The contract tells us the Pistons believe in him, and in that sense, I think that Wiseman is effectively behind him. Now, Duren has made some nice passes to Wiseman when they've played together, but you look at some of the offensive rating numbers for that. Like, I think it was the Denver game, and I was like, oh man, these guys are connecting. And then I looked after the game, and I think they scored like 29 points in the second half. I might be wildly off on that, but I remember checking.
No, you're right.
I remember checking the numbers for that, and I was like, oh, that was not as pretty as I remember it. But yeah, so long story short, I think that his role currently with the Pistons is he's the backup 5. He's a player they like, but he either has to impress the Pistons or he has to impress someone else in the league because he's part of their team, but he's not locked in like Cunningham, Duren, Ivy, Thompson. Like, those are kind of the focal point of this regime's kind of team building.
Do you buy his on-ball creation?
I mean, I don't think he's going to be like Siakam, but I just think that he's going to be a guard's best friend down the line when if you get trapped, say he plays with a guard who gets trapped a lot, and say Cunningham just the 3 ball comes along like we all envisioned out of college, and teams just start trapping ball screens to get the ball out of his hands. Down the line, I think he could be a guy where you throw him a bounce pass, play in the pocket, catches at 12 feet. Like, he could put up a push shot, turning baseline to his left shoulder. He's got a pretty good jump hook. Now, teams started sitting on that a bit, like the Washington game. I think it was I can't remember if it was home or road, but he started like 3 of 11 or 3 of 13 that game, and it was brutal. once teams scouted that out. So from that standpoint, he's definitely got to build off just the jump hook, because if you're going to diversify your game and be a guy who gets 12 to 14 points a game versus someone who is actually a focal point of the offense, you got to have counters to what teams will throw you, because at that point, they're looking to stop you. And yeah.
So my thing with Wiseman too is, I kind of said this earlier, but it just comes down to me with, it depends, like for me, how high do you think his ceiling actually is? Because then if you really believe it's super high, then you should be giving him reps so he can have a chance to get there. If you think his ceiling, for me, like this is where I stand with it. If you're in the Pistons front office and you think Wiseman's ceiling is, his ceiling is just a backup 5. Well, why? I feel like at that point, okay, well, why are you really putting too many resources into it then, and really giving two possessions and trying to convert so much into it? If you think he's just going to, his best case scenario is as a backup 5. That's what I believe. Now, if you think his ceiling is much higher than that, you can develop him into something better than that, and then maybe you can use him as a trade chip down the line because of that. Okay, then yes, do that. I'd say that to say this. Do you think that he has, because I think one of the ways he can get there is if, I feel like you have to be pretty high, or not pretty high, but you have to believe he has some on-ball juice, which is something he's flashed, the ability to, again, like I said, grab a defensive rebound, go coast to coast and finish, or face up at the high post, drive to the rim, draw a foul, or score a bucket at the rim. If you buy in his on-ball juice, then I think you feel a little differently about his ceiling. So I say that to ask you, do you think his ceiling, there is a future, there is an alternate timeline where Wiseman does develop all that to where he is a guy who not only can roll to the rim and finish dunks and finish alley-oops and somewhat protect the rim, but he's also a guy, if you give him the ball at the high post, he can face up, hit a face-up jumper, drive to the rim, and he's kind of like this multifaceted offensive player where it's like, okay, we got to play him because he's just this kind of impactful offensive player. Is that something that you see that could be a possibility in his future? Or do you think at this point people should be thinking lower on his ceiling?
Let me put it this way. If he's a 5, you'll be ecstatic with his ball skills. Now, if he's a 4 and he has to face up, which obviously he can do, but he hasn't shown that he can do that, like generating high-level offense in the half court. I don't really view him through that lens necessarily. I think the Pistons look at Wiseman as a player they like, but I don't think that they're going to shortchange any of their key players to give him developmental reps. And I was thinking to myself how the Pistons season would play out if they were, say, the 11 or 12 seed and 2 games back of the play-in, because I was kind of thinking how they would treat the veterans if that happened and they could get, say a high-end second for Joe Harris and some salary filler or something like that. And that just got me thinking on this whole spiel of how they would handle the season developmentally. And I think that the players that, obviously Cunningham's their best player, so he's going to play. He has to play for them to do anything. But I think that Ivy and Thompson are going to play regardless of how well they play. And I think I'm really high on Jaden Ivey, but I don't think that he's a high-impact player yet. I think he'll get there. Duren, I think Duren's already good. I mean, you just look at his game. Like I said, I think he's a good dribble handoff player, historic offensive rebounder. And I feel like that's so unrealized in the NBA right now, especially if you play a small team. If you put a 6'7" guy, I know he's not huge. Yeah, Duren 6'10". He's not like Brook Lopez size, but if you put like a 6'7", 6'8" shrimp in the game, he's going to get 5 or 6 offensive rebounds. And he's a guy who he'll get fouled a bit. He only shoots low to mid 60s from the line, but that's good enough. Get your team in the bonus, just stuff like that. So I'm tremendously high on Duren as well. Like I said, I tried to avoid the Duren and Wiseman stuff because I think Duren played better last year. I'm just also high on Wiseman. So yeah, with that said, Wiseman is not going to lose developmental reps. I think that that's kind of the fear that Pistons fans have taken from the Warriors because Wiseman was hurting the Warriors' championship chances. But I don't think that he'll take away from the Pistons' developmental chances, especially because he's on a 1-year restricted free agency deal. They can cut the cord at the deadline if they wanted. they don't have to match any offer. I just think this is a case of Troy Weaver liked him coming out. It makes sense that if Weaver had him first, second, third on his big board that season to take a chance on him for the price they paid. And I was thinking to myself, because Monty Williams, 2021 was his second year with the Suns, I believe. I think that was the Jalen Smith year. I think he went 10 or 11. Nonetheless, but I was thinking, I wonder what he thought of Wiseman this season, because if he loves Wiseman or if he hates Wiseman, not literally, but maybe not a fan of his game, and he has full roster autonomy to make rotational choices, which he got a bag this offseason. And I think that Monty Williams will have final say over who he plays 99% of the time. So that's a factor too. I honestly have no idea how he'll view Wiseman, but that's definitely a factor.
All right, and to wrap up the podcast, I'll ask you this: what is your expectation? What's your prediction here for James Wiseman this upcoming year? If you had to, if I told you you have to get this prediction right, or in 9 months from now you lose your job or whatever, like if I told you that there's high stakes on this prediction, what do you think? What's your prediction of what Wiseman's going to do this year? What kind of numbers think he's going to put up? Maintain rotation? Is he impactful? All that stuff. What do you think the prediction is?
I think that he'll produce similar numbers to his Pistons tenure last season, except I think he'll score a little less or around the same, maybe one less shot attempts, but a couple ticks up percentage-wise. My prediction with Wiseman is that he'll play well enough to be a functional backup center, and that he'll get an offer in restricted free agency above the mid-level exception. But I don't know whether he'll play well enough that the Pistons will match that, which that's a cop-out answer from me. But I could just see him getting, 3 years, $45 million, and the Pistons think to themselves, can we develop this player at that salary? I mean, his salary this season's $12 million, but once you get an offer sheet, that's a pretty long-term commitment. So my total cop-out answer is he'll be a solid backup. He'll showcase the stuff that makes a guy like me go crazy. He'll have believers around the league. He'll get an offer, but I'm not certain that he'll be part of Detroit's long-term future.
All right, quick answer here. Do you think Wiseman and Duren will be able to play together at some throughout this year? Do you think they'll get to a point? Because I do think they'll see it sometimes. Do you think that, because Wiseman, we've seen videos of Wiseman, photos of Wiseman, he looks really slimmed down, like really slimmed down. He looks like he's getting ready to be more on the perimeter, at least what it looks like. Do you think that Wiseman and Duren actually can play together, or do you think that's a recipe for disaster?
They'll play together. Stewart and Duren will be a better front court in tandem than Wiseman and Duren, in my opinion.
All right, fair enough. All right, Jackson, appreciate you coming on, man. I hope Wiseman has a good year. He's a good kid, absolutely good. He works hard, and like you said earlier, it's not from a lack of effort. Anything that we criticize with Wiseman is not because he's not trying. I just think that it's going to be tough. I think it's going to be tough for him. I think he has to. The tough thing for him is that I think he needs reps badly, and he got screwed over because he got hurt and wasn't able to get those reps. But the thing when the Pistons traded for him last year was, oh, well, this team will be able to give him reps. They're not trying to win anytime soon. He'll be able to get all the reps he wants to be able to get better with his feel and know where to be. But now it seems like after getting Monty Williams, now it's got me questioning, will he actually be able to get those reps to develop? So we'll see what happens. I hope he gets enough reps or in his reps, he's able to really develop because there is a player in there. He's a very raw player, but there is some legit skills there. I just hope he buys into the role they have for him and he's able to develop on the mental aspect of the game. If he's able to do that, I think he could have a long career. So rooting for Wiseman. Obviously, he's on the Pistons. We're rooting for him. So we'll see what happens. Jackson, thank you for coming on, man. You guys can find Jackson over on Twitter at Jackson Lloyd NBA. Covers NBA content. So I'll say this real quickly before I end the podcast. I want to give Jackson credit because he's one of the only NBA content people I see on Twitter who have said positive things about Killian Hayes before. Now, he's not some Killian Hayes like stan, but he's the only one who doesn't just straight up say he's awful and will be out the NBA this season. Like, I've seen you actually say some positive things about him before. So thank you for that, for all of us in the Killian fandom club. So We appreciate it. That's all I've got for you guys today. Thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. Free and available on all your podcast platforms. Hit that subscribe on the YouTube channel. Leave us a 5-star review whenever podcast platform you're listening to this on. And until next time, I'll see you guys later. Stay safe. Till next time. Peace out.